Welcome to Lesson 3, an operational approach. I'm your instructor, Matthew Mitka, and one of the co-founders of Greater Than Learning. What we're going to cover in this lesson is a definition of a data ethics framework and a bit of a breakdown of what that means. We'll look at the 5 key functions of an operational data ethics framework. We'll then highlight how it supports proactive, reactive, and retroactive decision-making in a modern information business. And we'll go through a scenario to show how this approach supports individuals, teams, and organizations in making the most socially preferable decisions. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to understand the definition of an operational data ethics framework and its importance in a modern information business. You should be able to understand what social preferability is and why it is used as a North Star in a data ethics framework. Be able to understand what the key functions of the operational data ethics framework are, and ultimately be confident to have a discussion about alternative, more operational approaches with your colleagues, your peers, and members of the Greater Than Learning community. In Lesson 2, we went through some of the key limitations of principles-based approaches, but how do we make it easier to make ethical decisions in a modern, fast-paced, and complex organization? It's about creating behaviors and habits that interface directly with the everyday workflows of teams designing, building, deploying, and iterating on data-enabled products and services. But before we go into some of the detail with this, let's start with the definition of a data ethics framework. A data ethics framework is the consistent process an organization executes to decide, document, and verify that its data processing activities in both the intent and the proposed outcome are socially preferable. Let's unpack that quickly. Organizations need consistency and they crave certainty. The messy and at times ambiguous ethical decision-making process must be transformed into something that is repeatable at scale. Decisions need to be made one way or another. Yes, lots of granular decisions, but the bigger ones where ethical trade-offs are made. They need to be documented for ongoing learning, for the purposes of openness and transparency, and to provide an audit trail for external stakeholders to learn from. In the social sciences, there is a concept called social preference, which essentially is describing a tendency that we have as humans to not just care about ourselves and any benefit that comes from a decision, but also to factor in the needs of others. A great deal of the overlap in principles can be addressed with this North Star of social preferability. In this approach, you don't design for what is unacceptable or settle for what is acceptable, which is basically what you can get away with. This is what most of the market does. But what you do is you optimize for the most socially preferable options possible. We'll touch on verifying this with social preferability experiments when we explore the framework later in this video. Important to note that organizations' purpose, values, and principles are still foundational, but with this operational approach, the principles become embedded in the functions of the framework to support and guide individual and collective decision-making. Let's look at these 5 key functions. The 5 key functions are a core data ethics team, an issues backlog, a key decision log, social preferability experiments, and a knowledge base. A dedicated cross-functional team owns and leads this work. They provide directional focus, groom the issues backlog, and own key decisions while transparently articulating the trade-offs that inevitably get made. They define and lead the social preferability experiments and model the behaviors needed to create sustained change. The issues backlog. Issues can be raised using a predefined format by anyone in the organization. This creates a new item in a Jira project backlog. These items are groomed regularly by someone like a product manager. The key decisions log. This is a centrally accessible repository of decisions and trade-offs made by the core team and other personnel that relates to the ethical collection and processing activities of customer and stakeholder data. Social preferability experiments. This model and supporting methods enable new bodies of empirical evidence to be consistently generated. This evidence serves the purpose of guiding decision-making and overcoming certain biases. It involves participation from a diverse array of stakeholders like customers, various subject matter experts, and even regulators. The knowledge base. This is a central place like Confluence, housing the organization's principles, relevant framework documentation, and supporting tools, along with learnings and insights. It acts as a repository of knowledge by making decisions and the results of the experiments easily accessible. This operational approach factors in proactive, reactive, and retroactive decision-making. So proactive might be when thinking about a new product feature, the data collection and processing and its use, its purpose, and the outcomes that enables for the customers. It can support reactive decision-making. When things go wrong and issues need to be surfaced and public-facing communications put out there transparently about remediation. And also when looking back on a product or service feature to address ethical issues that have been surfaced upon review or through connection to other functional aspects in a product or service design. We'll explore various scenarios in the forum discussions and other learning activities, but let's explore this now with a proactive scenario and a visual representation of an operational framework. This visual representation is absent all the dynamic interactions and processes that play out every day in a modern organization, but we can't take it in all at once, so let's zoom in and look at the key functions of this framework using a scenario. Let's say you're in the early stages of conceptualizing a new feature to a customer problem worth solving. It involves new and possibly unique data processing activities. And it seems impossible to achieve the business outcomes and the ones that customers care about without this new data. The product owner working on this new feature goes to the knowledge base and selects consequence scanning as a tool to work through some of the possibly negative consequences that may arise with this new feature. The team involved runs the collaboration consequence scanning session, but there is still a lack of clarity about how to move forward. It's assessed against the principles, but the principles in and of themselves don't help nailing down the right decision here. There is a sense of the approach and what might be the most socially preferable option, but it needs to be run by other stakeholders. The product owner grabs the data ethics issues form, populates the fields, and submits. This issue the team is tackling is automatically added to the issues backlog. The next day, the PM of the core ethics team is grooming the backlog and sees this new issue. She realizes that this feature is highly strategic for the company and decides that it needs to be prioritized and brought into the core team meeting running early next week. In that meeting, this issue is brought into focus. The new data processing activity seems to be within the bounds of the law, but there are still some gray areas. It's decided that there needs to be some testing done in a social preferability experiment. Relevant notes from the session are added to a key decision log by the product manager of the core ethics team, and a new social preferability experiment is added in the Jira project pipeline. The product owner is brought into a session with the core team to plan out the experiment with a tight 5-day sprint being defined. But there needs to be some additional perspective from other subject matter experts from the business before it is ready. One of the data protection lawyers are brought in to clarify some questions. All the relevant material is easily accessible and available to them. They review the material and deliberate. From a legal standpoint, the proposed experiment seems good to go. This is a great opportunity to get the regulators involved. They contact the relevant data protection authority with some context and ask them to check out the publicly available information in the decision log. It's all open and accessible via the public Confluence space. It's now time for the design sprint. It's an intense week, and the team collaborates to produce 2 low-fidelity clickable prototypes. One is hypothesized to get an acceptable score. The other, a little more ambitious, is aiming for the upper bounds of social preferability. Now, to put them to the test, 10 participants, with 2 of them from the regulatory body, are involved in this research. Now, It's not a statistically significant sample size, but it's enough to gain more clarity. Next week, the data from the research is analysed. The core ethics team PM and the product owner update the key decision log and knowledge base with evidence and learnings from the experiment. There is much more clarity in the product team on the right pathway forward now. The learnings are all there for future reference and available for the whole organisation to learn from. This operational approach enables easier alignment to principles, supports diverse stakeholder participation, builds empirical bodies of evidence, and embeds clarity into people's existing workflows, making the most socially preferable options easier to take.